Welcome to my channel, friends. Today, we'll be diving into the story of the film Miller's Girl. This film revolves around a teacher who struggles to resist the allure of a young, intelligent, and beautiful student. So, without further delay, let's begin the explanation. The story follows a girl named Cairo, who lives alone in a quiet, isolated house since her parents reside in another country. Passionate about writing, Cairo spends most of her time immersed in books. One day, while walking through the forest, she arrives at class and meets Jonathan Miller, a middle-aged teacher. Jonathan once aspired to be a successful writer, but ended up teaching instead. During class, Jonathan asks Cairo to read books from the syllabus, but she has already read them all. Soon, her close friend Winnie arrives, and together they leave to grab something to eat. Jonathan noticed an adult book among Cairo's belongings. Just then, his friend Boris walked in to grab his coffee. He picked up the book Jonathan had found and began reading it. Both Jonathan and Boris were taken aback when they realized it was a copy of a book written by Jonathan himself. Later that night, Jonathan's wife, Beatrix, tried to get his attention, but he was distracted by the events of the day. He casually mentioned, "A student was reading my book in class today." Shortly after, Beatrix received a call from her friend, Amy, which interrupted their conversation. After the call, Beatrix and Jonathan had a drink together, growing closer, but just as things began to heat up, Beatrix got another call, leaving Jonathan frustrated. The next day, Jonathan shared the experience with Boris, who made fun of him. As they spoke, they saw Cairo walking from the jungle, and Jonathan couldn't help but closely observe her. He asked, "Aren't you scared walking through the jungle?" Cairo's response was, "I am the scariest thing in those jungles." Jonathan couldn't help but laugh. At school, Winnie deliberately dropped her books, knowing Boris would notice. With a smirk, Boris asks her, "What do you want, Winnie?" She teasingly ignores his question, while Cairo watches them both. Annoyed by Winnie's antics, Cairo tells her, "You're completely crazy." Despite the exchange, the two of them head to Cairo's house together. Once they're home, Cairo is frustrated with her college admission form, specifically the question asking about the biggest achievement of her life. After thinking for a while, she realizes she has nothing truly unique to write about. Winnie, never short on suggestions, says, "Why don't you write about having an affair with your teacher?" Cairo hesitates, saying Jonathan is 20 years older than me. But Winnie insists it's normal nowadays, and Jonathan is a gentleman. He'd be perfect for your first time. She even starts talking about how Jonathan looks at Cairo in class, making the younger girl blush. Cairo's feelings start to shift as she listens to Winnie, and her curiosity about Jonathan grows. From that moment on, Cairo becomes more aware of him in class. The next day, Jonathan approaches her after class and asks her to meet him privately. After class, Jonathan invites Boris to dinner, and as Boris leaves, he playfully dances out the door. Intrigued, Jonathan tries to replicate the dance step himself. Just then, Cairo walks in, and both of them burst into laughter before brushing it off. Jonathan was impressed by a paragraph Cairo had written and found himself memorizing it word for word. Cairo, noticing his attention, felt a sense of pride and happiness. Jonathan, eager to encourage her, suggested she write a short story in the style of her favorite author. If she succeeded, he promised to give her full marks on her midterm. Cairo agreed without hesitation, and to Jonathan's surprise, she revealed, "I've read your book too." Like Jonathan, she could quote many lines from his book word for word. Jonathan was taken aback by her memory and literary knowledge. To further discuss her assignment, he invited Cairo to meet him over the weekend. That night, Jonathan and his wife, Beatrix, went out to dinner. When Winnie appeared to take their order, Beatrix asked, "Is she the girl you were talking about?" Jonathan quickly replied, "No, that's Cairo." It became increasingly clear that Beatrix was growing jealous of Jonathan's attention toward Cairo. Frustrated, She vented her anger by insulting Jonathan in front of Boris. "You've lost that special spark," she said bitterly. "You haven't written anything in years, and now you're just another ordinary teacher." Over the weekend, Cairo went to the spot Jonathan had mentioned, with Jonathan following shortly behind. He sat next to her as a man began reciting a poem. Jonathan listened intently to every word, while Cairo's gaze remained fixed on him. After the poem ended, Cairo stepped outside to light a cigarette. Jonathan joined her, sharing the cigarette as they silently bonded. The next day, Cairo appeared before Jonathan wearing an eye-catching dress. Boris, noticing her change in style, asked about it, but Cairo remained silent. Once Boris left, Cairo and Jonathan began conversing more openly, growing closer with each passing moment. Later, while on his way to class, Jonathan received a message from his wife about making plans to go somewhere. Inside the classroom, Cairo shared her thoughts on her favorite author, explaining the style she would use for the short story. Jonathan, eager to leave and return home, quickly agreed to her plan. After Boris left, Winnie playfully climbed onto Jonathan's table and started teasing Cairo. Not long after, Boris returned to meet Jonathan, but Winnie continued her playful antics, teasing him as well. She even slipped his phone into her clothes as part of the teasing. Meanwhile, Cairo was searching for her phone but couldn't find it. On the other side, Jonathan's plans to go out with his wife were unexpectedly cancelled because she had to work late. Just as he was settling in, Jonathan received a call from Cairo. It turned out that Jonathan had accidentally taken Cairo's phone with him in his bag. Since his evening plans were already ruined, he decided to head over to return the phone to Cairo. When Jonathan arrived outside her house, it began to rain. Cairo, dressed in a thin, wet dress, stepped outside to meet him. As they stood there, the rain falling softly around them, they locked eyes. Without saying a word, they leaned in and their lips met in a kiss. After their encounter, Jonathan returned home, only to find an email from Cairo waiting for him. Meanwhile, his wife, frustrated, told him, "I can't focus on my work with you here." Jonathan, sensing her irritation, decided to retreat to a small cabin to have some space. Once there, he printed out the story Cairo had sent him and began reading. To his surprise, it was an adult story featuring a student and a teacher much like Jonathan and Cairo's situation. As he read, Jonathan became aroused by the narrative. He couldn't resist the temptation and removed his pants, caught up in the story. But everything changed the following day. Jonathan, no longer the same, distanced himself from Cairo. He didn't call her, as he had done before. Cairo, confused and hurt, asked him, "What happened?" Jonathan replied coldly, "I didn't like your story. It's full of mistakes." When Cairo insisted, "It's about us," Jonathan replied firmly. "There's nothing between us. We're just a teacher and a student, nothing more." His words crushed Cairo's heart. Jonathan, determined to maintain control, said, "Either rewrite it, or I'll fail you in the midterm." Cairo, angered by his response, snapped back, "My story is perfect. You're just scared because I wrote what you were too afraid to write." In an effort to humiliate Jonathan, Cairo called him a common writer and boldly challenged, "If you have the guts, fail me now." After their heated exchange, Cairo returned home in tears, seeking comfort from her friend Winnie. The two of them drank together, attempting to ease her pain. Meanwhile, Jonathan was clearly tense and frustrated by the situation. His wife noticed his mood and asked, "What's wrong?" Jonathan, unable to hold it in, shared the details of Cairo's story with her. His wife, intrigued, became excited by the tale. But before they could act on their feelings, Boris arrived unexpectedly, leaving Jonathan feeling frustrated once again. At Cairo's house, she and Winnie had a conversation. Cairo confessed to Winnie that Jonathan had only been pretending to be close to her. Determined to distract Boris, Cairo suggested that Winnie message him. Winnie tried teasing Boris, but her efforts seemed to have no effect. Cairo, desperate for a reaction, decided to take a bolder approach. She and Winnie stripped off their clothes and posed provocatively. Sending their photos to Boris, they waited for his response. As soon as he saw the images, Boris abruptly left Jonathan's house. That's when Jonathan's wife received a call from the school. The entire institution had already caught wind of the affair between Jonathan and Cairo. Shocked and furious, she turned to Jonathan, asking, "Why is all of this happening? Is it just because of a student's written story?" She pressed further. "Did something else happen between you and that girl?" Jonathan quickly denied it, but his wife's doubts lingered. The following day, Cairo was absent from class. Instead, she found herself sitting in the vice principal's office. Both Cairo and Jonathan were called in to explain the situation. The vice principal, clearly aware something was off, asked them both, "What's going on here?" Cairo didn't hold back. "Jonathan gave me a midterm assignment in advance. We smoked cigarettes together, and we also met outside of school." When it was Jonathan's turn to respond, he hesitated. His discomfort was evident, and the vice principal quickly pieced everything together. With a heavy sigh, he suspended Jonathan from his position. Outside the office, Boris confronted Jonathan. "You should have known your limits," he said, shaking his head. "Now look at you, you've crossed the line, and this is the consequence." Later that evening, Jonathan returned home and told his wife about his suspension. Her suspicion turned into disbelief. "Did something happen between you and that girl?" she asked once more, her voice tinged with anger. Jonathan denied it again, but his wife wasn't ready to accept his refusal. "Do you have feelings for her?" she demanded. Jonathan remained silent, and the tension between them grew. Their argument escalated quickly, each blaming the other for the situation they found themselves in. The fight grew so intense that, in the end, Jonathan's wife made the painful decision to divorce him. Meanwhile, Winnie met with Cairo. She coldly remarked, "What you did caused Jonathan to lose his job." Cairo no longer cares about Jonathan's actions. She expressed that Jonathan had underestimated her, but now he would truly understand who she was. Cairo shared these thoughts as part of her greatest accomplishment. She further mentioned that not only did Jonathan lose his job, but now his wife would also feel the consequences. Would he even be able to write anymore? As these words hung in the air, the movie came to a close. So, friends, that's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content. I'll be back in the next video, and until then, stay tuned and peace out.